This prisoner had a peculiar habit. During every yard time, he'd sidle up close to the guards, sneaking glances at the keys on their belts. Back in his cell, he'd meticulously sketch every curve and notch from memory. If even a single line was off, he'd patiently start over, pursuing absolute precision. But that's not all. At 3 a.m. sharp, he would light a match and study the keyhole on his cell door. Then he would carefully tear off a small piece of paper and press it against the lock. In no time, he'd have the shape of the keyhole, which he would trace over with a pencil. Once done, he'd take another piece of paper, roll it up, and slowly insert it into the keyhole while gently pressing down with his pencil. It took nearly 20,000 attempts before he finally measured the depth of the lock. But even with all that, he couldn't bring himself to celebrate, because the trickiest part, figuring out what the key was made of, remained unsolved. The next day, Mike seized a chance to tell his cellmate about his plan, hoping to get some ideas. 2 days later, his buddy came up with a risky scheme. But for a shot at freedom, Mike was willing to gamble. So, while working in the woodshop, he took advantage of a distracted guard and swiped a few sturdy wooden sticks, planning to smuggle them out in his thermos. But things took an unexpected turn. As Mike was leaving, his nerves got the best of him and his expression gave him away, raising the guard's suspicions. The guard grabbed Mike's thermos, poured out the coffee without hesitation, and shook it violently for a good minute. Strangely, after a thorough inspection, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, so he had no choice but to let Mike go. Little did anyone know, that small oversight would later leave an indelible stain on the prison's reputation. The moment Mike got back to his cell, he couldn't wait to dump out the wooden blocks from his thermos. The reason he managed to evade the guard's search was because he had planned for this exact scenario. When the guard approached, Mike's accomplice intentionally knocked over a box of nails, creating a distraction to buy time, while Mike hid in the back and stuffed a wad of towels into the thermos, narrowly fooling the inspection. With all the necessary components now in hand, Mike got to work on the wood. He kept his eyes glued to the material, not missing a single detail. Even the tiniest splinters were sanded down until they were smooth and even. Half an hour later, all the pieces needed for the key were finished. Next, he carefully applied glue to the surface and meticulously assembled each part. To speed up the drying process, the warm light bulb overhead conveniently served as a natural heater. After 30 seconds, Mike picked up the wooden key, confirmed it was securely bonded, then took out his blueprints to double-check everything before making final adjustments. After numerous rounds of fine-tuning, a complete wooden key finally took shape. With a mix of nervousness and excitement, Mike slowly approached the cell door and gently inserted the key into the lock. Holding his breath, he turned the key, full of anticipation. With a crisp click, the iron door actually swung open. Instantly, an irrepressible grin spread across his face. But his elation was short-lived as he soon faced an even bigger problem. He deflated like a punctured balloon, his earlier excitement vanishing. The thick steel door in front of him loomed like an insurmountable mountain. And most disheartening of all, its lock could only be opened from the outside. But there was no turning back now. Mike decided to start working on a second key. From then on, whenever he found a spare moment, he would put all his energy into memorizing the shape of the guard's key. Every night back in his cell, he would secretly work on crafting it. As about a week later, the second replica key was finally complete. To test it out, Mike snuck over to the door during a group work shift while his cellmate kept watch in the distance. Whenever the key got stuck, he would immediately pull out a small tool hidden in his sock and make adjustments on the spot. After a few tweaks, Mike was thrilled to find that he could smoothly turn the heavy iron door. However, just as he was about to rotate the lock cylinder back into place, the key inexplicably jammed. With a slight push, the key suddenly snapped in half with a crack, nearly scaring Mike out of his wits. As if on cue, his lookout buddy signaled a warning. Mike started to panic, frantically digging at the lock cylinder with his fingers. At the critical moment, his cellmate quickly grabbed a tool from their room. Mike lunged for it like a lifeline and immediately started hammering and prying at the lock. Footsteps drew closer and closer, and even his accomplice was anxiously tapping his foot. Just 1 second before the guard arrived, Mike managed to pry out all the wood shavings, but the latch was still exposed. After the guard left, he immediately dropped his mop and rushed back to the door, desperately pounding on it. But no matter how hard he hit it, his swollen hands couldn't get the latch to budge. Out of options, he could only resign himself to fate. Collapsing onto his bed, he waited uneasily for his potential punishment. Not long after, the guard came for the routine lockup. Mike's head snapped up like a startled animal. He thought he was done for, but to his surprise, when the guard saw the protruding latch, he simply glanced around before shutting the steel door as usual. Inside the cell, Mike's heart was pounding out of his chest, but the surroundings remained still. Only then did he let out a huge sigh of relief. Although he had narrowly avoided exposure, his determination to escape was still burning strong. Soon after, Mike crafted a new key, but the real challenge was figuring out how to unlock the cell door from the inside. The three of them gathered in the cell to strategize. Suddenly, one of his cellmates had a flash of inspiration and proposed a plan. Tie thin wires to both ends of the key, then thread it through the gap in the cell door and use their hands to guide it precisely into the keyhole. But Mike immediately shook his head in disapproval, pointing out that the key wouldn't be able to turn that way. John suggested using a wooden stick instead of string, but such a long stick would be hard to hide. They discussed for ages but couldn't come up with a feasible method. Then one day, while working in the shop, Mike happened to notice a rotating disc in his cellmate's hand and had a sudden brainwave. He made a wooden wheel and attached the key to it. All he had to do was extend it out the window and align it with the keyhole. But after several attempts, he realized the key wasn't the right size. He had to retract it and make adjustments with his tools. After a few tries, Mike finally managed to unlock the cell door from the inside. He was so excited he could almost jump for joy. But right then, a patrolling guard walked by. Mike was scared out of his wits and hurried to pull the key back in. But his nerves got the better of him and his hand slipped, accidentally dropping the key on the ground. Now the situation was critical. The guard's footsteps gradually approached and Mike was beside himself with anxiety. He took out the gum he had been saving for Christmas, quickly chewed it a few times, then went to the window. With all his might, he extended the broom out the window with the gum stuck to the tip. Mike planned to use the stickiness to pick up the key. He was just about to succeed when, as he carefully withdrew the broom, the key and gum fell back to the ground together. At this point, Mike was extremely anxious and on the verge of losing control, but he had to force himself to calm down and keep trying. The gum would only stay sticky for 2 minutes at most, so he had to hurry. After a few rounds of repeated attempts, he finally retrieved the key. With the crisis averted, Mike breathed a sigh of relief and slowly laid back down on his bed, his heart still racing. The next day, he excitedly sought out his accomplices and couldn't wait to share the good news with them. The three of them instantly saw a glimmer of hope. From then on, they used the same method to make the remaining cell door keys, carefully burying each completed component underground to avoid sudden inspections by the guards. A month later, all the keys were finally finished. They agreed to test them out that night. Mike first made a human-shaped dummy out of his pillow, then met up with John. The two of them tiptoed downstairs barefoot and began trying the keys one by one. To successfully escape the prison, they had to get through a total of 15 heavy doors. Mike had painstakingly crafted 39 keys, each lock cylinder different from the next. They had to test them individually and mark them to save time. But as soon as they tried one door, a patrolling guard appeared and the two quickly retreated. There wasn't time to go back upstairs, so they could only hide in a storage cabinet downstairs. But to their dismay, the cabinet couldn't be locked from the inside and the door wouldn't close tightly. Mike had no choice but to tightly grip the screw, but the screw was too short for his fingers to get a good hold and kept slipping out of his hand. Worse still, the guard had already walked over to the cabinet. The two of them held their breath, staring outside, afraid of making the slightest sound. It never even occurred to the guard that two inmates could be hiding in the cabinet, sneaking out. He lazily went upstairs for his routine check as usual. When he got to Mike's room, he didn't even notice the dummy on the bed, just casually glancing in before moving on. At this point, the two men in the storage cabinet quietly opened the door and carefully edged forward. After confirming there were no guards around, they continued testing the keys. Before long, they arrived at the last heavy door, but still hadn't found the right key when they heard footsteps coming from upstairs. Realizing the patrol might be over, they quickly locked the iron door and hid back in the cabinet. At the same time, the guard had just reached the stairs. He noticed a few drops of sweat on the ground and asked himself if he had been sweating, finding it strange that he hadn't left them. The two men in the storage cabinet were trembling all over, their hearts pounding, terrified of being discovered. Luckily, the guard looked up at the ceiling and assumed it was water dripping from above. He wiped it away and left. Only then did the two breathe a sigh of relief. After quietly closing the wooden door, they snuck back to their respective cells. To prevent a surprise inspection by the guards, Mike disassembled the key and hid it in his toothbrush cup. Early the next morning, Mike was woken up by the guard, having missed the bell. The guard suspected he had been up to something during the night, so he conducted a surprise search of his cell. Everything in the room was turned upside down. The key was well hidden, but the one in the toothbrush cup fell out. The guard slowly picked it up. Fortunately, Mike had separated the key's teeth from the handle. The guard didn't recognize it as a key and asked him what it was. Mike calmly responded by grabbing a photo of his parents and wedging the key teeth in it, saying it was a photo clip. The guard believed him and left empty-handed. After this incident, Mike realized they couldn't wait any longer. The next day, he found his fellow inmates planning to invite everyone to break out together. However, to his surprise, at the critical moment, not a single person was willing to act with him. It turned out they were all afraid of the escape failing and didn't dare face the consequences of being caught and brought back. But with freedom just one step away, Mike and the other two refused to give up. They had already decided to make their move tonight. That evening, all the guards clocked out and left, plunging the prison into dead silence. Mike sprang into action, first releasing John and Paul. The three of them quickly changed into the civilian clothes they had prepared in advance and jogged over to the main gate. However, just as they were about to open the door, they heard a noise from downstairs. The three slowly released the iron door so they could retreat at any moment. Only after the noise disappeared did they continue. They silently made their way downstairs, originally planning to temporarily hide in the storage cabinet to avoid the guards' first round of inspections. But when they entered, they discovered the wire they had prepared was nowhere to be found. Mike searched the ground but couldn't find it. Left with no choice, they could only hold it with their hands. At first, they thought it would go as smoothly as before, but they didn't expect today's guard to be holding a tool, heading straight for the storage cabinet. It turned out the guard's toilet had clogged and he had come to the storage cabinet to find a tool. When he stood up, he accidentally dropped the wire lock, but he didn't pay it any mind. Now he was taking the opportunity during his inspection to put the tool back in the cabinet. If he opened the cabinet door, it would inevitably lead to a confrontation. At the critical moment, there were no inmates escaping upstairs. Suddenly, someone smashed a light cover, causing a short circuit. Accompanied by a few shouts and commotion, the guard was thrown off. Abandoning his plan to open the storage cabinet, he turned around to deal with the situation upstairs. His teammates' misdirection plan had succeeded, buying them precious time to escape. The three of them didn't dare delay for even a moment. They quickly rushed out, expertly unlocking one iron door after another. Before long, they arrived at the final door. Even more exciting was that the main gate outside was wide open. They hugged each other tightly, celebrating their impending freedom in advance. However, the unexpected always comes out of nowhere. Because they had never tried this door before, they didn't know which key would work and could only test them one by one. Time trickled away bit by bit and their hearts slowly sank. After trying the last key, the door still wouldn't budge. This door had become their biggest obstacle. Mike despaired and suggested giving up and going back, but his accomplices refused to admit defeat. They grabbed their tools and frantically pounded on the doorframe. The huge commotion frightened Mike and he backed up a few steps, trying to dissuade them while running to the next room. The barrage of banging was sure to attract the guards. By the time Mike rushed back to stop them, he found the doorframe had already cracked, exposing the latch. He held his breath, waiting patiently despite his fear. After dozens of fierce blows, the door was finally broken open. However, the moment they stepped outside, they were horrified to discover a guard armed with a weapon patrolling the wall. Fortunately, they had come prepared. They took out a small mirror to observe his movements. As soon as the guard turned and left, they immediately moved swiftly toward the main gate. In this manner, the three arrived at the gate one by one, then used the same method to rush to the street. Even so, their tense hearts remained on edge as they simply kept their heads down and silently proceeded. It wasn't until two guards passed by without recognizing them that they finally breathed a sigh of relief. The three men were like wild horses set free, galloping unimpeded through the liberated world until they reached the train station. They hailed a taxi at random and instructed the driver to head straight for the border. Early the next morning, the guard unlocked the cell doors as usual and called for the inmates to come out for roll call. But only Mike and the others were nowhere to be seen. When the guard entered the room, he was shocked to find not Mike, but a crude dummy on the bed. The guard was utterly baffled as to how a living, breathing person could simply vanish into thin air. But by the time he realized what had happened, it was too late. The three had long since crossed the border by car. This is a true story. Mike's real name was Tim Jenkin. He was a quiet craftsman, or more precisely, a fighter for freedom. How did he accomplish something that seemed impossible? The answer is to break the goal down into achievable small steps, like a series of small keys, unlocking them one by one until finally reaching freedom.